Hello there. If you watch any other YouTube entertainment content, you may have noticed a few channels talking about media that entered the public domain on the 1st of January. You may have also noticed they made it very clear to stipulate this was in the US only.
I should say that what I'm about to tell you is based on US copyright law.
Well, in this video I'm going to explain why that stipulation was made, in the first of a series of videos looking at the differences between the UK and the USA. Mostly I'll be comparing and contrasting the good, the bad and the ugly of remakes of content from both sides of the pond, but occasionally, as in this video, I'll be looking at some of the other quirky differences between the media in our countries. So, a brief explanation of what public domain is. Basically, any piece of media you create, whether it be books, films, music or any other creative endeavour, is automatically copyrighted to you, the creator, unlike patents or trademarks which you have to apply for. You are credited the copyright as soon as your creation is created. In reality, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but not much. So, this video you're watching right now is copyrighted to me, and if someone uses it without my permission, I have certain legal avenues I could pursue. Again, it's a little more complicated than that, as there are fair usage exceptions, but I think you get the general idea. Now, this copyright only lasts for so long before the creation becomes public domain, meaning anyone can use it for free. How long something needs to exist before it becomes public domain has changed over the years and varies from country to country. In the US, it's fairly simple. 95 years after a piece of art or media has been published, it becomes public domain. So, those videos you might have seen will have talked about anything that was published in the US in 1927 or earlier. Films like Wings, the first Oscar-winning film, or books such as the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, the last Sherlock Holmes book to enter public domain. Some quirks of this are that the character of Sherlock Holmes had already entered public domain years earlier, as the first appearance of the character in the US was A Study in Scarlet in 1890. The character has been free for anyone to use in the US since 1985. However, you could only either adapt A Study in Scarlet or an original story featuring the character at that time. Now, you can adapt all the stories. This is important because the character is not fully formed in that first novel, so any character trait that came along in later books could not be used. However, now everything is available. In the UK, however, this is not the case. Our copyright law says that works enter the public domain 70 years after the death of the author, which means that Sherlock Holmes canon in its entirety entered the public domain here in the year 2001, as Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1930. There are positives and negatives to both systems. For example, George Orwell's works became public domain in the UK in 2021. However, 1984 won't enter the public domain in the US until 2045. And by contrast, Agatha Christie's works won't enter public domain in the UK until 2047, but several of her books are already public domain in the US. Where this gets much more complicated in the UK, that is more simplified in the US, is when it comes to films or anything with multiple authors. Films in particular are very complicated. As the law says, a film enters public domain only when the writers and the director of a film have died, and if there's music written for the film, the composer of that music too. So, the film Wings I mentioned, the first film to win an Oscar, which entered public domain this year in the US. Well, of the writers, director and composer of that film, the director was the last to die, and that was in 1975. And so that film will not be in the public domain in the UK until 2046. Many films which will enter public domain in the US in the next few years will be decades away from entering the public domain in the UK. In fact, very few films are in the public domain in the UK because one of the creators I mentioned lived long and hopefully happy lives. The law in the UK used to be similar to that of the US, but was actually only 50 years. So, in 1976, some early Hitchcock films began entering the public domain, and this continued to happen until 1989, when the law was changed and all Hitchcock films re-entered copyright. And some won't be public domain until 2066, because the writer lived until 1995, 70 years after his death. The law also changed in the US due to a high-profile lawsuit from Disney to hold on to the Mickey Mouse trademark for a few more years, until, coincidentally, next year. But when this extension came, it was not applied to anything already in the public domain, and for a while applied to foreign-made films like Hitchcock's early British films. This law has since been changed so that Hitchcock's British films remained tied to British law, while his first American-made film, Rebecca, will enter the public domain in the US in 2036, 15 years before the UK. If that sounds confusing, it's because it is. Purposely so, I suspect. I hope that this has given you some insight into how and why copyright and public domain works differ in the UK and in the USA, and I promise my next UK versus USA video will be a bit more fun. Thank you. Goodbye.